in some classroom somewhere. Perfect. That looks like just about everybody in here. Great.
How's it going, Chingo?
So the slides that you see should be
What's up?
changing automatically without you having to give any input. But if there's some sort of problem, you can just let me know. So, as I said, I'm Jeff. I used to be in the uni not too long ago. I've been out for almost a year. I used to be a senior personnel officer, and I also used to be a titles officer. And then I left the uni to join Sleeper Social Club, and I've been there ever since. And Sleeper Social Club, if you don't know, is a C5 wormhole space PvP corporation. So we do PvP all the time in all areas of space. You're able to get in touch with me if you need to on Twitter or by sending me a forum PM. I'm always available to help out with any questions that you might have after the class if you want, or later down the road. I can point you in the right direction of anything that you might need if you're confused or something like that. I'm also well versed in things that happen in the uni and the different programs that you have. So again, any questions, feel free to reach out through any means, and I'll be able to take care of you. We do not do Wardex, no. We've been Wardecked, but when we live in space where we get PvP'd all the time, it really has no impact on us. Okay. So what we're going to talk about first is just answer the question, what is tackling? You might have
Thank you
heard
for the
it,
follow.
you might not
Much
really
appreciated.
know what the role is. So we are going to give you a little bit of a background about ships in EVE and why the tackling role is necessary. So it's important to note that all EVE ships have some sort of inherent warp core strength. So every ship has a warp core strength of 0, and if you're not tackled and you have a non-negative warp core strength, you're always able to leave the field. So the purpose of tackling is to keep people on the field. So if you're out chasing somebody and you want to kill them, if you aren't able to tackle them, they can just get away from you. It's as simple as that. So this is a very important role for all fleets. It's a very easy entry-level role, and it can be done with something as simple as a Tech 1 frigate, but there's more advanced ships, and the more advanced ships in the game that we'll talk about a little bit later have some little fun tricks that we can briefly talk about. And no, we do not have a fleet up because there is no practical for this. It is just a lecture so you can relax wherever you want. Now, as I mentioned, most ships have an inherent warp core strength of 0, but that is not necessarily the case for all ships. For example, deep space transports, which are a Tech 2 industrial class ship, have a roll bonus that gives them +2 warp core strength. And the reason why this is important will be apparent when we cover the modules that you use to tackle. Yes, ventures. Again, I'm just going to link the slides for the newcomers that I hear and joining Mumble. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to link some of these ships so that you can see if you click on them. So the Venture, if you click on that in game, you can see under the roll bonus that they have a +2 bonus to ship warp core strength, and the same with the Akator, which is the Galente Tech 2 deep space transport. It also has a +2 bonus to warp core strength, among other things. Uh, the other module that lets you increase your warp core strength is called a warp core stabilizer. And you can fit this to your ship, and it will increase your warp core strength by 1. So I'll just link this also in Fleet so that you can take a look. That's the Tech 1 module. So you're able to fit more than one of these. You can fit as many as you can fit given their CPU usage on your ship, and it takes up a low slot. So for example, I'm sitting in a Tech 3 right now, out in wormhole space, and I have 6 lows. So I could fit 6 warp core stabs, provided that I have the fitting space on my ship, and I would have 6 warp core strength that would have to be dealt with by somebody who wanted to tackle me. Now, what's important to know about tackling is that as long as your warp core strength is 0 or higher, you are able to warp off freely. If your warp core strength is negative, which happens when somebody puts one of the tackle modules on your ship, you are considered tackled and you're not able to warp anywhere. The only exception to this rule are bubbles. Bubbles you won't see in high sec, you also won't see in low sec, but you will see in null security space and you will see it in wormhole space. Bubbles can come from specialized ships, which we'll talk about, or they can be anchored, and their purpose is to prevent you from warping, period. So there's nothing that you can do. You can have as much warp core strength as you want, but you won't be able to warp out as long as you're within the bubble. But you can get away if you just fly your ship out of the bubble and then try to warp. And there is one exception to that rule, which is interceptors that are nullified, as well as Tech 3 ships that are nullified. They can ignore bubbles. Now, we're going to talk briefly about the skills that you need in order to be a tackler. So we're going to talk about the basic skills, and then we're going to talk about a couple of additional skills that go above and beyond the minimums that you need, that you might find useful if you're interested in taking on this role in a fleet. Luckily for us, tackling requires a very, very minimum set of skills. All of you can fit in, you can all sit in some sort of frigate right now, so the amount of skills that you need to train in order to be a tackler is actually very minimal. So the minimum skills that are required in order to fit one of the tackle modules is CPU management trained to 3, navigation to 2, and propulsion jamming to 1. So that's an incredibly short train, relatively, in EVE time. And provided that you have those skills trained, you're going to be able to fit the tackle modules that you need to be a tackler in fleet. Now, of course, there are Tech 2 modules which will require more training, but the meta versions of tackle modules, as well as just the Tech 1 version, can be fit with those skills. Now, some recommended skills for a tackler, there's a whole bunch, but I'm going to touch on some of the ones that I consider to be very important, and then I'll talk a little bit about the other one. As a tackler, you need to be fast, and that's actually well suited to being in a frigate, because frigates are very agile and very quick. So they can get into warp fast. That means they can land on the targets that you want to tackle faster. But if you can only fit an afterburner, you're going to have a hard time chasing somebody down to tackle them. So the first 2 recommended skills that I have here, Afterburner 3 and High-Speed Maneuvering 1, gives you access to micro warp drives if you don't already have access to it. So the micro warp drive is a significant speed boost over your afterburner, and it's very useful as a tackler because you're able to close the distance between you and the ship that you want to tackle, and then obviously get them tackled. The third skill that I have listed there is signature analysis. I put 4 because the signature analysis 5 is a very long train. But signature analysis allows you to lock ships faster. So as a tackler, you might be up against another fast aligning ship, and you want to try to tackle them before they get away. Signature analysis will let you lock them up faster and get your point on them before they can warp off. If somebody initiates warp before you manage to lock and tackle them with one of your modules, they'll be able to get away. So that's why it's important to tackle them quickly using signature analysis. And then finally, acceleration control. I also listed 4. This just gives you a speed bonus to, in this particular case, it's going to be your micro warp drives that I've recommended. That's coming up, Mercury. Mercury. Yeah, so acceleration control is just going to give you additional speed out of your prop module. Certain other skills that you can train just improve your ship's agility, the number of targets that you can have, the number of ships that you can have targeted at once. Any of the armor or shield skills, so if you can train into Tech 2 armor, Tech 2 shield, as well as the armor and shield compensation skills, as well as general fitting skills will help you as a tackler. But these skills that I've highlighted are what I consider to be highly recommended if you want to fill the tackling role. Now, I want to talk about these tackling modules, and yes, this is where we will discuss what a point is and what getting a point is. And you will understand the meaning behind people calling out point or grabbing point as soon as I explain it. So there are 3 types of modules that you can use for tackling. The first is the most common, and it's the one that I would recommend that you get started with. It's called a warp disruptor. Actually, I'll link it in lecture. This is the Tech 1 version. And what the warp disruptor does is it is worth 1 point of warp scramble strength. So this is where the term point comes in. So when you tackle somebody and people call out, oh, I've got point on Bob, for example, this is what they're referring to. Point has become just the general term for grabbing tackle on somebody. In general, you're not going to say, oh, I have 2 points on somebody necessarily. You'll just say that I have somebody tackled. But this is where it comes from. Now, if you recall from before, we discussed that your warp core strength can be 0, in which case 1 point of warp scramble strength is enough to tackle you because this tackle strength will subtract from your stability. So it would just be 0 minus 1, and you'd be in the negatives, and you'd be unable to warp. But for ships that are fitting a warp core stabilizer, or for ships that have the inherent warp core strength roll bonus, 1 point is not going to be strong enough for you. So if I have just 1 warp core stabilizer fit, I'm going to have 1 warp core strength on my ship. And then if you pointed me with a warp disruptor, I would have 0 and still be able to warp off. So that's how these modules versus the other modules sort of interact with each other. Now the warp disruptor is recommended because it has a long range on it as compared to the other 2. The Tech 2 version has a 22-kilometer base range, which can be expanded upon if you're in a specialized ship. There are some ships that have bonuses to your tackle module. So like a recon ship, for example, which is a Tech 2 cruiser, can point out to 50 plus kilometers. Overheated if you're using some sort of faction version. So that's a very, very long range that you can get, but 24 kilometers is pretty nice as well. The second module that we have in the column there is the Warp Scrambler, and this is a little bit different than the Warp Disruptor because it has an additional bonus to it that the Warp Disruptor does not. Yes, Knight, you would. That's why hunters, when they're out searching for ventures or something like that, will often fit a dual scram or a scram and a point, depending on how much they have on their ship. Now, the scram that I just talked about has 2 points of warp scramble strength, so it's sufficient enough to tackle somebody with only 1 warp core stabilizer, but it's not sufficient enough to tackle somebody that has a roll bonus of +2, or somebody that has 2 warp core stabilizers, because 2 minus a 2 is 0, and 0 is none. It's not a negative number, so you can still warp off. Now, the important thing about the Warp Scrambler is that in addition to having these 2 points of warp scramble strength, it also turns off an opponent's micro warp drive. So this is a very strong module, and the drawback to that is that you need to be very close to your opponent in order to be able to activate it. So you can see there that the Tech 2 version of a Warp Scrambler has a 9-kilometer base range, which means that you need to get up in their face in order to use it, which can be incredibly dangerous, especially if they have short-range weapons that can shoot you as you're trying to get up on them. So let me just link the Warp Scrambler. And no, there is no penalty to fitting more than 1. Unlike other modules in the game where there are stacking penalties, you will not get a stacking penalty from using one of these Warp Disruptors. So if you have 2 Warp Scramblers, you'll have 4 points of Warp Scramble strength. It's not going to be 3 point something. It's going to add up as much as you have. Now, the reason why turning off an opponent's micro warp drive is important is because if your opponent can get out of your tackle range, then they're able to warp off. So very fast ships that have a micro warp drive fit are able to try to kite you and get away from you. And if they can get outside of your range, then your module will deactivate and they'll be able to get away. Now that's going to be an awful lot harder to do if you have them scrammed with a Warp Scrambler, because typically, and this is not in all cases, but typically you'll have only one option fit, so you'll either have the afterburner or the micro warp drive, and if their micro warp drive fit and you turn it off, there's nothing they can do other than go at their base speed. And because you're in a frigate, probably with a micro warp drive, as I've recommended, you'll be able to keep up with them no matter what they try to do. Finally, the last module that I want to talk about is the Stasis Webifier, which I will link. Now this I want to mention because it's sort of a tackle module and it's sort of not. It doesn't do any points of warp scramble strength. So if you just web somebody, they can still get away. In fact, if you web somebody, they can get away faster, and I'll explain. So the Tech 2 version of the Stasis Webifier has a 60% reduction in your target's velocity. So that makes them very slow. Now, because you need to get up to 75% ship speed in order to be able to warp, if you web somebody without them being pointed, they'll be able to get away and warp off faster, because they'll reach that 75% much quicker, especially if they've already been moving. However, it's also useful uh, if you want to stop somebody from approaching a gate, for example. So oftentimes, if you're out and about and you're trying to tackle somebody on a gate, or you tackle somebody outside of a station, they might decide not to aggress you, and they might try to crash the gate, as it's called, which is they don't use any offensive modules, and they just burn towards the gate, and they jump through to the other side, and you can't jump through because you've activated an offensive module. So that's crashing the gate. And a stasis webifier will help you keep them away from jump range on a Stargate. It's also useful, as I said, on stations or on wormholes if you wanted to stop somebody from getting back to the wormhole. So that's why it's useful. But again, as I mentioned, it has no points to it. So by itself, you're not going to be tackling anything with it unless the person forgets to warp off. Now that we've covered the three main types of tackling modules, I'm going to show you how to tackle. Well, I'm going to explain how to tackle. And I don't want you to think that I'm being facetious when I show this next slide, but tackling is very, very simple. It can be very, very complicated, but at the very base level, tackling is very simple. So assume that you are sitting in your frigate and you have your micro warp drive, and you have either a warp disruptor or the warp scrambler fit, and you're off to tackle somebody. This is how you're going to do it. It's very easy, as you can see. So all you have to do is you want to lock the target and approach and or orbit them, because obviously each of your modules has a certain amount of range, so you need to get close to them in order to be able to use them. Now you can either approach them or orbit them, whichever one you think, and then all you have to do is activate your module and they'll be tackled. Now when you do activate your module, this is typically when people call out that they've got point on a ship. You'll usually call out that you have point even if you're using a scram. It just signifies to the fleet commander that you got them down. If for some reason you're up against a ship like a Venture, and you have them, pointed and scrammed, you might call it that you have a point and a scram, just so the FC knows. But really, those are the three steps that you need to know to tackle, and it is incredibly easy to do just from a basic point of view. Now, you don't necessarily need to do all of these three steps in a sequential order. You don't need to approach them, and then after you start approaching, lock, and then after you have them locked, activate your tackle module. You can actually start doing these things combined, which is very nice. What you may or may not know is that you can activate an offensive module without having a target. And I didn't know that when I was a new bro, but it's very useful. So if you're out in space and you click on your guns, or if you click on an offensive module, it'll start flashing, but it won't do anything because it doesn't have a target. So if you click on your point and then you click on the target in your overview, it'll immediately start locking them up if they haven't been locked, and then it'll immediately activate the module on them. It's the same for guns. You can use your guns before you have a target, and they'll just sit there blinking, and then as soon as you have somebody that you want to shoot, you just click on them in the overview, it'll lock them up, and it'll start shooting. So it saves you time, and while it's doing that, you can also be clicking on them and approaching them or orbiting them. Quite simple. Now tackling is fantastic, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, all fleets need tackle. It's one of the easiest stepping stones that you can make into PvP, in my opinion. Because as I said, if fleets don't have tackle, then whoever they want to try to kill is just going to warp off, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Now, of course, there are some specific types of doctrines where you might not necessarily need tackle, but in general, for the vast majority of fleets, especially in E-Uni, you will be welcome on a fleet with a Tech 1 tackle frigate. So don't let that worry you if you're wondering about joining a fleet, because if you X up and say, oh, I can only bring a tackle frigate, they'll be more than happy to have you along. Finally, just to wrap up this class, I want to mention some advanced tackling topics. Now, this is just an introduction to tackling, so we're not going to go too advanced, but I just want to mention some of the advanced ships, and then I will get to that question from Kivis in lecture.E-Uni. But just to give you a little bit of taste of some of the fun things that you can do as a tackler, it's not all just sitting around in a Tech 1 frigate. There are more advanced things that you can do, as I alluded to earlier. Now, the first thing that I will show you is an interceptor. Interceptors are Tech 2 frigates that are incredibly fast. Let me show you an example. This is one of my favorite interceptors, the Malediction. It's the Amar Tech 2 tackle frigate. There are two types of interceptors. There are sort of attack or sort of combat-oriented interceptors, and then there's fleet interceptors. The fleet variant, like the Malediction, are much faster at the expense of not being able to do as much DPS. And you can see that it has a reduction to the propulsion jamming system activation cost, which just means you can run your point much longer. And it's also, of course, immune to bubble. So it's very fast, it's immune to bubbles, it's very useful as an initial tackle, and it's very useful as a fleet scout. Fleet scouting is outside of the scope of this class, but it's something that you can do if you're interested in tackling, and if you're also interested in being ahead of the fleet. All fleets that are out roaming will need some sort of scout, so it's a very, very fun role to play because you're sort of independent. You're out ahead of the fleet, you're relaying intel back to your FC, and then you're grabbing initial tackle and trying to stay alive so the cavalry can come in and save you. So it's very cool. And skilled interceptor pilots are always in demand. If you can fly an interceptor, which is a relatively short train, there are many corps that will love to have you once you're done.
Yeah, it's only 26 days.
Uni. And finally, the last two ships that I want to cover are interdictors. There are two variants. There's the destroyer variant, and then there's the cruiser variant. The ship called the interdictor is a Tech 2 destroyer. It can fit a bubble launcher, which looks an awful lot like a probe launcher, but it throws out bubbles in space. Again, bubbles only happen in nullsec and in wormhole space. And that permanently will tackle somebody as long as they're within that bubble. So it's a different type of tackle, but it's very useful. You'll see people calling out on fleets if they're going to go to nullsec that they're interested in getting an interdictor, or they just call it a dictor in sort of Eve slang. So that's something fun to train into. And then a heavy interdiction cruiser, or a HIC as we call it, is the Tech 2 cruiser. And they can do two things. One, they can generate bubbles around them. So that means they can generate a bubble around their ship and actually move around. So the bubble moves with them. So that's great. If somebody's trying to get out of your bubble, you can keep the bubble moving with them and keep them permanently tackled. And they can also do something called Infinipoint, which you may or may not have heard of. It applies an infinite amount of warp scramble strength. So it doesn't matter what you have. If you get infinipointed by a HIC, you are not warping off anywhere. And HICs are the only things that can tackle like supercarriers on a gate. So that's why they are very important in more advanced fleet. And then the drawback to being this powerful is that as long as they're using either their Infinipoint or if they're generating a bubble around them, they cannot receive any remote assistance. That means Logi can't rep them, for example. So you're vulnerable, but you're powerful. And that is it for the class. That's all I wanted to cover in terms of advanced topic. And I will answer that question from Kivis right now. And Kivis asks, what would I recommend for the orbit distance for a disruptor or a scram? Uh, it really depends, is the answer. When I'm out about in my malediction, which is the interceptor, I generally fit it with a warp disruptor because I want to be able to spin around them very fast but at a long distance, which means that they can't scramble me, which would make me highly, highly vulnerable. So usually, uh, I'll orbit somebody at 20 kilometers, for example. So if I have a 24-kilometer range on my point, 20 kilometers as an orbit means that I have a little bit of wiggle room if they try to run away from me, and I'm at the long end of my orbit trying to come back to them. Now you might want to make that a little bit tighter if you want, but you don't want to get too close because you know that within 9 kilometers you can get scrammed, which was going to shut off your micro warp drive and then make you a sitting duck. In terms of an orbit distance for a scram, if you're scramming somebody, you're already in their scram distance, so that doesn't really apply in this case. So you can get as close as you want. If you are a frigate and you're scramming something that is much bigger than you, like a battleship, you'll want to orbit them very closely. So if you can orbit them at 2 kilometers or 1 kilometer, and you can have your micro warp drive on, and you can just be spinning around them super, super fast, they won't be able to shoot you, and you'll be able to keep them scrammed for as long as you can run your modules. So provided that you're cap stable, you will be able to just keep them tackled until the cavalry comes, or until they maybe have a web and they try to web you down, or they deploy drones and they try to kill you, for example. This is an interesting question. Let me pull up the HIC for. I'll bring the Amar one just because I like Amar. This is the devoter. And devoters, which is a HIC, can fit this module. That's the module that unscripted will create the bubble, but they can be scripted with this. Focused warp disruption script. This is the InfiniPoint script. It has nothing to do with anything, but that's what it's called. So if you read the description of the warp description script, it says that this module, this allows the module to scramble ships of any size, including ships normally immune to all forms of electronic warfare. So, because this is counted as a scram, it will turn off your micro warp drive, and as I said, it's an InfiniPoint, so there's no getting away. If you are pointed, InfiniPointed can be used micro jumps. A micro jump drive is like a micro warp drive. So if you have somebody only pointed and not scrammed, they can use it and get outside of your tackle range. But if you have them scrammed, it's turned off just like it would turn off a micro warp drive. So the scram in this case would be more useful against the battleship, and that's why battleships, when they're out and about in hostile space, aren't generally too worried about somebody coming and pointing them, because a lot of them will be sitting on a mobile depot. They'll just throw on their jump unit, and they'll just jump 100 kilometers away from you, and then they're automatically outside of your range. And usually they'll have something like drones to try to kill something that gets close enough to scramble it. And to answer the question that are outright immune, capital ships that are in like a triage mode are immune, but they're also not going anywhere. So if you go into triage, you're stuck in spot, and you can't go anywhere anyway. So you are immune, but at the same time, you're not going anywhere. And they're the only ships that you have to worry about that with. Now, you might be wondering, I mentioned that interceptors are immune to bubbles, but you might be wondering, okay, if they're immune to bubbles, does that mean that they can't be tackled? The answer is that they can be tackled as long as it's a tackle module. So they can be affinity-pointed, they can be scrammed, they can be webbed, they can be pointed, but if you launch a bubble, they can warp immediately out of it. That's a good question. So the question is, if you're flying in a PvP fleet, what should you be doing as a tackler? Uh, and the answer to that really depends on the fleet that you're on and the standing orders that you have from the fleet commander. So sometimes, if you're on a big fleet, the fleet commander might tell you to spread points. And in general, what that means is you'll look for somebody with the first letter that's the closest to your first letter. So my character name starts with a J, so I'm going to look for the opponent that it starts with a J or a K or an L or something that's close to my letter, and I'm going to tackle them. However, if the FC is calling a primary, you don't want that primary to get away. So if there's very few tackle ships on the fleet, or if you're the only tackle ship, you want to be going after them and holding them down until it looks like they're going to die or something like that. Or if somebody else calls out that they have a secondary point. Now, calling out primary and secondary points is important because if one person goes down, you want to make sure that your opponent can't just warp off. So that's why often you'll stack multiple points on somebody. Or if the whole fleet has points, they might all point one person, or they might spread points if you know that you're winning and you don't want anybody to get away. Perfect. Does anybody else have any questions at all about anything that I didn't cover or forgot to cover or something like that? You can also ask in Mumble as well. Sounds like no. So if nobody has any further questions, then that will be the end of this class. I hope that you found it informative. I would ask, if you don't mind, to please give me feedback on this class. This is the first time that I've taught this class, and it's also a new set of slides that I created specifically for this class. So I would love to get your feedback. So I'm going to link the class thread in Mumble, and I'll also link it in lecture.E-Uni. And if you can just mention any constructive feedback that you might have for me there, that would be much appreciated.
Thanks, Jeff.
My pleasure. The other benefit to commenting on a class thread coming from an ex-titles officer is that when they're looking for your next E-Uni title and they're wondering if you've been getting involved, if you have some sort of constructive comment on a class thread that shows not only were you there but that you learned something, that looks very good in your favor when you're looking for the next title. So I will just add that in as a little hint for you guys. Bonus tip, if you will.
Take that advice.
Perfect. And I'll hang around for a little bit. If any of you guys have any questions, now that this class is over, you're free to go. If you have any questions in general about anything that I can answer, feel free to just pipe up and ask, even if it's non-tackle related. I'll hang out for a little bit. Otherwise, have fun out there. Go join a PvP fleet in a tackle frigate. Oh, you know what? One thing I should mention. and I think I mentioned it in the class thread. There's this new thing called the Free Tackle Forget program in E-Uni. So if you're actually in E-Uni and you're not in the public, uh, there's this new program that Julian Celador has come up with, and I'm supporting it. And I would be remiss not to talk about it in Tackling 101. I'll link it there in lecture and here. Basically, what it is you can talk to him, and he will give you a free fitted tackle forget using this thing he calls the Nui doctrine. It's just each class or each race has a certain tackle frigate that can be used, and he has them all for free. So you can talk to him if you want one, or sometimes he's going to have them up on contracts. So he has some up in Stackmon right now. And I also asked him to have some available for the fleet that I'm taking out on Sunday. So if you want to join a PvP fleet, please feel free to use that program. Take advantage of it. It's there for you to use. So that means that you have absolutely no money on the line. You'll actually make money if you insure your ship. If you want to go out tackle and then you get blown up, you've made money. So by all means, you guys have the tools, you have the knowledge. Now the best thing that you can possibly do is go out there and get some experience in a real PvP setting. So go nuts.
So I've got a question for you. Why are you in bad standing with the uni?
I am bad standing with the uni, and you guys are bad standing to me, actually. And that's because we shoot each other. And that's why we've been marked as -5. So the uni has blues, but we really don't have blues. We'll have temporary blues in Sleeper Social Club. But otherwise, if we find you out somewhere, we're going to kill you. So that's sort of it's a mark for you as the uni guys to know that, okay, these people are going to try to kill me. But it's a friendly sort of thing. I'm going to be guest FCing this weekend, and I will obviously not be shooting you because we'll all be on the same side. And we have a long history. My corporation was started by an Eve University member, and we do sleepovers with you guys. And the people that come on sleepovers, they join our corp for a little bit, and then we sometimes we'll come to one of the campuses and we'll try to get a fight. So these people that are on the sleepover can shoot their uni friends when they're on the sleepover, and then go back and laugh at them and who won and who lost and stuff like that. So we're -5, but that doesn't really mean much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for everything.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming. Does anybody else have any random questions about anything that I can help answer while I'm here?
What is the answer to life?
Good question. Full
42.
Give me a second, I got a quick one.
Sure.
I got one right.
Go right ahead.
What would dictate you to use manual piloting while you're trying to tackle your target?
A lot. Common sense, mostly.
Well, I just don't know like what the whole manual piloting thing is like used for as a whole when you're tackling. That's what I'm trying to. I guess that's
Sure.
what I'm trying to ask. Like, what is it used for exactly?
I'll explain one of the main reasons why you might want to manual pilot. Manual piloting in